Thank you, Colin, and welcome everyone at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning to the inaugural Directors Seminar to mark the International Day of People with Disability. And it is fantastic to see at 3 minutes past 10, nearly 150 people logged in for this wonderful seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. And here in Parkville, where I'm privileged to be sitting, that land is owned and has never been ceded, and it's owned by the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and I embrace their continued connections to this place. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders from other communities with us today. And I ask that wherever you're sitting watching this seminar, whether that is in metropolitan Melbourne, country Victoria or interstate, that you just for a moment consider the traditional owners of the land on which you have the privilege to be. I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to our guest speaker this morning, Professor Louise Purton from St Vincent's Institute and St Vincent's Hospital, as well as the University of Melbourne. It's great. Louise and I have known each other for a long time, and I've had the privilege of being guided by her in many aspects of the gender equity work that WEHI's been doing for the last 10 years. And I really want to acknowledge her leadership in that area. And it's just delightful and a privilege to have her speaking today on another topic, and that's around disability and research. Over a number of years, WEHI has embarked on a journey of discovery around our institutional biases and privileges. And in 2017, we published our first diversity and inclusion strategy with the aim of continuing to build a workplace where everyone can thrive through strengthening leadership capability, improving sight of data, and improving transparency and accountability, and addressing biases in our everyday processes. A key focus of our work has also been on creating a culture of inclusion. So fast forward to 2021, and we now have well-established programs and policies around support for women in STEM, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and LGBTQIA+ staff and students. Today, we're going to turn our eye to a somewhat less discussed, but no less important area of workplace inclusion, and that's disability. WEHI understands that people with disability still experience some of the highest levels of discrimination and exclusion in the workplace. International Day of People with Disability is held on Friday, the 3rd of December, and challenges us to look at the way we think about disability and challenges us also to grow to be a more inclusive workplace. And really, for us to fulfill our mission, we need the brightest minds available. And of course, that includes people who are living with disability. This seminar is one way that WEHI is starting a conversation, not only those with those living with disability, but with supervisors and science and professional services staff alike. And I think the most important first step we need to take in this conversation, as it often is just to listen, to hear the stories of people living with disability, the barriers they face to inclusion, what's worked and what hasn't worked, and how institutions like WEHI can better support them, and how individuals can be good allies. It's vital that our work is guided by the principle, nothing about us without us, which is the disability rights movement has the principle the disability rights movement has championed for many, many years. This is an important reminder that no policy should be decided without the full and direct participation of the people who are affected by that policy. And that's true whether we're thinking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policies that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation, LGBTIQA+, or of course disability. And given that we are within the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, it would really be remiss of me not to acknowledge that women with disability are more likely to be impacted by intimate partner violence. Amplifying and celebrating the voices and perspectives of women with disabilities is a key way that we can contribute to changing this story, obviously for the better. As well as hearing from Louise this morning, I'd first like to introduce today's Q&A moderator, Belinda Zipper, who's a WeHi staff member in communications and marketing team and someone who lives with a disability. Over to you, Bel.
Thanks so much, Doug. Hi everyone, I'm Belinda. I'm a member of our emerging staff-led disability reference group, and I've been living with Parkinson's disease for 7 years. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Louise Purton. Louise is head of the Stem Cell Regulation Laboratory at St Vincent's Institute and Professor, Department of Medicine at St Vincent's Hospital. She received a PhD from the University of Melbourne in 1995 and undertook postdoctoral studies at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Centre in Seattle. In 2008, she established and headed the Stem Cell Regulation Unit at St Vincent's. Louise is passionate about fostering the career development of young researchers and is an advocate for supporting all minority groups in the workplace. She's had a profound bilateral hearing impairment since she was a child. After we hear from Louise, we'll have a moderated Q&A and we welcome your questions. But first, Louise, I thought we could run through a Slido poll. So if everyone has gone to Slido yet and put in WeHi Disability, if you could answer this question, how many people do you think in Australia have some form of disability? We'd love to hear your thoughts. 1 in 20, 1 in 8, 1 in 5, or 1 in 12? Just give that another minute. So it looks like things are evening out between 1 in 8 and 1 in 5. The actual answer is 1 in 5, which actually surprised me as well. I thought it would have been lower than that. Louise, what are your thoughts on that?
I actually am not surprised it's 1 in 5. I know that 1 in 7 people have a hearing disability, although often it's as they become more older. 1 in 5 does not surprise me at all, but it doesn't really reflect what we are aware of in the workplace, and then that is a real surprise, I think.
I also think it's interesting that of the people living with disability, only 4% use a wheelchair.
Exactly.
So it's quite a diverse group. Before I turn to Louise, I just want to say one more thing. If my voice and tone seem a bit stunted this morning, it's because I take medicine for my Parkinson's, and because I was a bit anxious about today, the medicine hasn't kicked in too well. So hopefully by the time we come back for the moderator session, I'll be feeling a little bit better. But Louise, over to you. And it's my privilege to welcome Louise today.
Thanks, Val. And I'm actually sharing my screen now. And I would like to, first of all, thank everyone for being here today. I'd like to thank Doug for his beautiful introduction. He made me cry, and that's not something that's easy to do these days, but it is also an emotional day for me because talking about my personal journey is never easy. And this is actually the first time I've been invited to speak about being a disabled person in academia. I've been invited to speak about my research program a lot, and I've been invited to speak about being a woman, but I've never been asked to speak about being a disabled person. And so I'm really honoured to be here to represent the disabled people in the community, and I'm very honoured to be the inaugural seminar presenter, and thank you everyone for inviting me. So this slide here, it has a symbolic meaning for me because when I first spoke out and truthfully about my career path as a woman, it was in front of my peers who needed to hear it. And the first slide included this opal slide, and the one that you will see here on the left is the one that I presented. And since then, I've become much more aware about being accessible to everyone. And the one on the right is actually for those with colour blindness or colour vision deficiency, we might say. And I think it's really important that we all start to become aware of being accessible for everyone. We do a lot of imaging in our lab, and if for some reason the images are not quite looking as sharp or contrasty, we always publish in supplementary form now. Okay, so this is my personal journey, and you need to understand what I've done and what has happened to me in my life. I come from a small country town, southern New South Wales, and I'd like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of Muti Muti, which is where I come from. I grew up with a lot of Indigenous people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, many who I actually have had the fortune to know. When I was 3, and this is actually a little part of a jigsaw that we couldn't really quite pinpoint when I lost my hearing, but when I was 3, I almost died. I had an intestinal abscess, and for 3 weeks I was in hospital. My parents were told not to get their hopes up, that I was a very sick little girl, and they couldn't guarantee that I was going to survive. I had a long way to go. So I was in hospital for 3 weeks with tubes hanging outside of my body, draining the poison that was trying to kill me. And then when I returned home to my small town, which was an hour drive from where the hospital was, I had to be on high-dose antibiotics because you can't stitch up the wound properly, and I can actually see the stitch marks, and I have a very ugly scar. But those antibiotics that saved my life also likely took most of my hearing. And you can see here, this is an audiogram of my hearing prior to having a cochlear implant. I should say that for part of my childhood, my low frequencies, which are the first 2 parts here, I hope you can see my pointer, actually. I didn't check on that one. But here used to be more normal, and that's also important in my story, but this likely got wiped out when I was very young. And these are the sounds that I cannot hear. So naturally, I cannot hear any of these sounds, PH, SH, TH, F, K, S. I cannot hear whispers, I still can't. And prior to my cochlear implant, with my hearing aids on, I could only repeat 6% of words correctly without lip reading. I cannot follow conversations in noisy environments. And people think that I have an accent. So that's one of the first things that people used to ask me is, where do you come from? I come from Australia. I was born in Australia. I hadn't even left Australia until I was 24 when I went to the UK for 6 months of my PhD studies. And that's the first time that anyone ever actually identified that I was Australian. And it's a speech defect. But you also need to understand the experience that I've had, because it's not quite straightforward. And it's partly due to coming from a small country town. And it started when I was 3, which was 1972. So the hearing loss likely occurred when I was 3, but it didn't get picked up for a while. And when I was 5, my mother noticed that I did not respond to her if I had my back to her watching TV. And so she drove me 2 hours away to Mildura, 2 hours each way to an ENT. He tested my low frequencies, which at the time were normal. He told her there was nothing wrong, and he sent us home. When I was 8, an audiologist visited our town school and discovered that I had no high frequencies when my mother asked if she would test my hearing. So my mum drove me back to the ENT in Mildura. He tested my lows again. He said they were fine, and then my mum insisted that he test my high frequencies. And he said, well, she has none, but there are no hearing aids for her condition. And the only thing that probably will affect her is that she will not appreciate classical music, which actually is very untrue. So between 12 and 19 years old, and I say 12 because that's the last audiology exam I can find, I did not have any hearing assessments. I went away to boarding school when I was 14. My parents are not rich. They took out a loan because in the country you do not get adequate teachers to come, and in fact most of the students leave by the end of year 10, and my peers who remained and did their year 12 were actually taught for some of their subjects by primary school teachers who underwent a 6-week crash course to teach secondary mathematics. And I'm the first person from my hometown, Balranald, to achieve a PhD. I'm not the first to get a professor. My friend beat me to that, but I beat her to the PhD. Although we're not, well, we're kind of competitive, but not really. Anyway. So I had no assistance at school because although we knew about my hearing impairment, my teachers knew about my hearing impairment, everyone thought that it was being adequately monitored and assisted, and it wasn't. I actually taught myself to lip read and I don't sign. I was brought up in a normal community. I have had no interactions with the deaf community. I excelled at school. I'm a high achiever and I obtained the marks to do medicine, but I chose to do science. And despite being told that I would not appreciate classical music, I actually love music and I voluntarily sang in the school choirs. I gave it up at the end of year 11 because I dropped music to continue with my academic subjects that I wanted to pursue. So my life as a person with a profound hearing impairment is that while I have a visible disability, many do not notice my hearing aids and now my cochlear implants. And I'll talk about my cochlear implants later because they're only recent. So most of my career has been with the hearing impairment I've told you about and shown you. People stare at me if I do not respond to them when I should. People assume that I have, that I'm normal, that I don't have a disability because I can't see my aids. People stare at me because my voice is loud, and it is loud, and it becomes louder in noisy situations because I can't hear myself, and so I speak louder to even hear myself. People think I'm rude if I do not respond to them in the way that they think I should respond. And I also talk too much on platforms like Zoom, and if anyone in the room, and some of you have been on a Zoom platform with me, you will understand what I mean. I'm consciously trying to reduce this. And I tend not to ask people much about themselves in social settings because I can't hear or understand them properly. I tend to talk more about myself. And all of these are common traits of people with a profound hearing impairment. And I need to also highlight that I'm using a lot of text because people who are watching this might also have a hearing impairment. And I know that for me, I need to have the text to understand what is being presented. And as I said here, the main content I get from my presentations is the information on the slides. So whenever anyone gives a seminar or at conferences, what is on the slides is the most important for me. And people these days are being trained to actually not have much content on your slides. That's actually reducing accessibility for people like me. In third year university, which is actually, I got my hearing aids in halfway through second year uni, because a friend of mine said that she had tinnitus, so ringing in the ears. She went to an ENT and he told her she needed grommets. And I thought, actually, I have tinnitus all the time as well. Maybe that's what my problem is. So I went to the ENT and he said, you need hearing aids. And that's when I got my first pair of hearing aids. And my parents were in denial. I called them up at the time. I could still understand a bit on the phone. And I called my parents up and told them. And I ran out a 5-hour drive from Melbourne. And my dad was in denial. He said, you don't need hearing aids. So I think it just shows how much I have managed to cope without hearing aids throughout my life and how much people really do not understand how much it affects my ability to understand and communicate with people. But in third year university, so I had some hearing aid devices that would let the lecturer wear a little microphone that then transmitted to my hearing aids. And I had a lecturer in biochemistry who would not wear it. After multiple efforts to try and get him to wear it and being embarrassed in front of the rest of the class, I finally went to his office one day and he said to me, "Oh, I'm glad you've arrived. I've just been on the case to the Equal Opportunity Commission on the phone." And I said, "Well, what did they say?" And he said, "Well, I couldn't get onto them, but I've decided to wear your device after all." And so it's really ironic because these days people, you know, record things. Back then we couldn't. This was in the late 80s. And it just shows also how much you can be discriminated against, and it does occur. I'm lucky I haven't had it happen to me so much, but that was one incident, and the biggest incident. And then another event that stands out is I gave a seminar in 1994 in Seattle on my search for a postdoc. And then at the end of my seminar, it was a dark room. People started asking questions. So I said, "Look, you know, I'm happy to answer questions, but can you please turn the lights on, identify yourself. I have a hearing impairment. I need to lip read. And then, you know, I can answer your questions." And so after the talk, after the seminar, after it had finished, a man came up to me, and I know this man now. He's a nice man, but he came up to me and he said, "Oh, well, that was a good one. You know, you don't have a hearing impairment." And I showed him my hearing aids, and he said, "Oh, you would never be able to tell you had it well." And these are the things that happen. So I started openly declaring my disability when I started giving presentations more often. And I'm not ashamed of my disability. I'm not afraid to declare it, although many other people are. And as Stephen Hawking said, disability need not be an obstacle to success, and it certainly hasn't been my biggest obstacle. So we get to my roller coaster career. I could talk for a long time on this, but I don't have the time. And so I'm just going to highlight some of the downs and a major up as well. So when I first went to Seattle, I actually did microenvironment research in my PhD. Not many people at the time were doing it, and there were not many people who were working on it. And I actually went to one of them who was in Seattle. I had a very, very bad experience there and left her lab after 15 months and moved into another lab. And she actually tried to prevent me from staying. She knows I speak about this now and she wants you to hear it. But she herself had been significantly discriminated in her career because she was a woman and she had internalized it. And she suffered from a condition called internalized misogynism. I think people need to be aware of this and its impact on people, on women more. And it certainly affects their personality and the way that they treat people. And so this was a very bad experience for me. The second really bad experience for me, and I don't name names, they also know that this is being spoken about, and I have copies of this slide, although they've seen a more detailed slide, is I was actually recruited back to Melbourne with the promise of a lab head position at an institute here by a man who's no longer there. And despite, so when I got back and I didn't get it in writing. I was naive. I trusted him. I was told I was a senior postdoc in the lab, but I self-funded myself. I got a lot of research grant funding and built up a small independent team, but was never promoted to lab head. And the reason that I was not promoted to lab head was that I was told I didn't have enough papers, yet they promoted a man who had fewer publications than me, and he still does have fewer publications than me. So what most people don't realize is that for 18 months between 2004 and 2005, I actually had a small group of people in Australia and also went to David Scadden's lab in Boston to be a long-term visiting scientist. So I juggled them both and I came home every 3 months. And that resulted in a self-senior author paper, which I'd already got the majority of work for. And I also had my first son that very same year. And then in 2008, I was recruited back to SVI to start a lab. This is where I chose to go to, and that's where my husband also chose to go to. I received 2 fellowships, 2 NHMRC projects, and then I had my second son in 2010, was associate director, and became an associate professor. Then between 2013 and 16, I had a significant funding shortage. This was a killer for me. It was really a difficult time. I did not get my SRF renewal, and because one of my 2 assessors gave me a 4 out of 7 for track record and leadership, despite all of my achievements and despite getting a clinical trial from the research that I had set up when I came home, I was not giving my 6-year funding due to that score. And that made me realize that being a woman is also a very big obstacle in research. And it's also why I've become very proactive in gender equity, because that's a much easier fix. But people with disabilities are not even accounted for in our funding system. And this is a Sapphire snap from my personal information. In Sapphire, you can see here, we asked about our gender, although non-binary is not specifically stated. And then we also asked if we're Indigenous, and this is the most important one to be tracking. But still, as a comparison, when I applied for an NIH grant in 2004, I had the option to declare my disability. 17 years later, I still can't declare it. And other minority groups, and there are many who are missing, are also likewise very important to include. And this is a very easy fix. It's time for change, and change is needed, and change is for the better. And we know that, but some people are very resistant to change. And I can understand that too, because in my whole life, I've been resistant to getting cochlear implants. And cochlear implants have actually improved so much that in the last 10 years, prior to 2018, I was told you qualify for cochlear implant, your hearing aids really are not giving you any benefit. You know, you need to have at least one. And I was really resistant because I love music and I love pure sounds. But in 2018, I experienced an episode of sudden hearing loss, and this made my hearing even worse. So what happened was actually my hearing aid went from, my hearing in the low frequencies went from okay to not okay, and I was really not coping. And I underwent very high dose steroids. They gave me 3 times the dose I should have. And so I went through multiple episodes of psychosis and withdrawal. It was a really horrible experience. And I was diagnosed with an acoustic neuroma, which is a benign tumor that affects hearing imbalance. And we think I've had it since at least 2008, when I had an MRI to try and work out why I was getting unexplained headaches. So I decided to have my first cochlear implant, and there were no guarantees of the outcome, because the longer you go without having had a cochlear implant after experiencing significant hearing loss, the less likely it is to succeed. The only guarantee I could have was that any hearing that I lost as a result, and I did lose more natural hearing in my left ear when I had it done, they would just get that back with the cochlear implant. So I took that risk, and it was a long road to adjustment, more than 12 months. But I'm very proud and pleased and happy to say that the implant was successful. And in July this year, the same day we went into lockdown 5, in fact, I came out of surgery and was told that we were in lockdown again. I had my second implant. So this is almost the end. I know that will probably be stressing. I don't want to go over time, but this is what a cochlear implant is. So you can't see this bit. This is inside my head. This actually, I can feel this bump, and it's around here. What they do is they cut behind your ear and they implant that there. And this is the external magnet, and you can see that here. Yeah. And I'll take it off just to make sure you can see it. And you can see that once I've got my hair covering it, you really cannot see it, which in some ways is a bit disappointing, because I was hoping that everyone would be able to see it because my hair is not black. But once I go all white, you probably will see it. Anyway, this is a CT scan. You can see here, these are actually the actual part that goes into the cochlea. And this is it here. There are 22 channels, and I can count them all. And these actually bypass the hair cells and transmit directly to my auditory nerve. So my ability to understand speech without lip reading has actually significantly improved. It's gone from 6% alone, and I was guessing most of them. One of them was actually mouse, and I remember when I heard that, I was like, that sounds like mouse, and I work with mouse, so I said mouse, and it was mouse. And at 3 months post second cochlear implant, I can now get 60% of words correct confidently, and actually 81% when it sounds similar. So that makes a very big difference in my ability to understand speech. So cochlear implants have significantly improved my life. I actually used to avoid the telephone, and now I can have telephone conversations, although I'm still reluctant to do that. And Zoom, etc., have much more improved. I can repeat a significant number of sentences in noisy backgrounds without lip reading. I do not experience constant tinnitus when I have them on, but when I take them off, I do have that. And while synthetic, and this was my biggest problem, and in fact, when my husband Carl was with me when I was switched on for the first time, he said, "Do I sound like a robot?" Just to tease me, because he knew that that was my biggest concern. And the sounds are now very natural, and I still love music, which is great. And I don't love rap, which is great too, because apparently sometimes you can actually change what you really enjoy. My voice changed within a week of my first implant, and it's still changing. I actually caught up with someone after the pandemic, well, after restrictions eased recently, and she said to me, "Your voice has changed even more." And change has definitely been for the better. So it is time for change, and people will know I advocate for change. We talk about it, a new normal in the post-pandemic life, and it's time for a new normal, and it's time for a new normal in so many ways. It's time to break down all the barriers and improve equity for all, and today's seminar and today's conversation is really instrumental in doing that for people with disabilities, and I can guarantee that changes for the better. And so for anyone out there who is really pushing through change and pushing through a tough time, I just say, hang in there, think of your role models. I have many wonderful role models in my life. Some of them didn't even have an education. It doesn't matter who they are, it's what they do and what they're about. And I'm very fortunate to also have many, many friends who have helped me as well through the tough times. My family, my lab, which is now one short, just the three of us now, but we're doing, great stuff. I'm really proud of them. It's really funny. Every single person here who's acknowledged has helped me with this talk, either in its initial presentation or this most current one. They're all at We Had To, which is really funny. And then my family, and the best roller coasters that I go on are the ones I go on with my boys. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Louise.
Thanks so much, Louise. I'm going to give the round of applause on behalf of all of the audience who can't clap. Thank you so much for your honesty and your generosity in sharing that aspect of your journey. I've heard you talk about the challenges around gender and medical research a lot, but I really very much appreciate your willingness to share that. It is so personal, and I can only imagine that it's difficult to do. And you've just been so, as I said, generous in your willingness to do that. So thank you so much. Of course, the conversation doesn't end here. One of our aims with this seminar is to increase the understanding of how WeHi can support all of our staff and students, including those experiencing disability. And as you've said, just as important for staff with visible disabilities as those where the disability may be hidden to their colleagues and the people that they go through life with. We absolutely understand that some staff need workplace adjustments in their environments to support them, and we're really committed to improving the way we do that. Some of the examples of adjustments might be things like changes to work schedules or procedures and practices, and of course modifying equipment and the way we train people. I think it's, I can remember so many times where I've sat next to somebody doing an experiment and given, verbal communication about how to do it. And I could just imagine how difficult that would be for somebody who was hearing impaired. And yet I probably didn't even think even to ask. So if you have a disability and require adjustment to enable you to more comfortably and effectively fulfill your role at WeHi, whether you're a staff or student, whether you work in research or professional services, please speak to your supervisor or your P&C business partner, because they are here to help. And the disability reference group that Belinda mentioned is also on the lookout for new members to help share the work on disability access and inclusion at WeHi. And the group will welcome people with a disability, those who experience chronic illness, carers and allies alike. And I think, as with gender equity and LGBTIQA+ inclusion, I think this is an issue for the whole of our community. It's not just an issue for people that are experiencing disability. I think if we truly, as an organisation, want to achieve amazing things in the discoveries that we make and the breakthroughs that we translate into improved healthcare, then we need to find ways of bringing everybody into that discovery process on as an equal term as we possibly can. And I think really that combination of decency and, in the end, productivity for the Institute is the challenge that we're all trying to confront. So once again, thank you, Louise, for sharing your insights, your expertise and your experiences with us. I'm sure that hearing your story will really help to drive us all to better recognise and celebrate scientists and professional services staff members with disabilities as the valued contributors they are, and as the leaders within the medical research field that they are. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Louise. Doug, we do have a few minutes for Q&A to the audience. Would like
Excellent.
to thank you, Doug. Really appreciate your words of reflection. I couldn't put it better myself. But we would like to also open up another Slido poll, if we can get that on the screen. So it's one that we came up with that sort of illustrates some of the ways that people deal with, well, people with disability have to respond to ableism. So the example is, which would you be examples of ableism at work when speaking to someone who's recovering from a stroke? So the first one is, oh, I hear you. I once broke my arm. It was so hard brushing my teeth. I heard that many stroke victims fake it to get compensation. My aunt had a stroke, but she was much older than you. I guess you get to use the disabled toilets. Lucky you. Now, the results are coming in quite quickly. It's obvious, it's a bit of a loaded question, because I think most of us would agree that this question really is one that speaks to the ways in which there's these tiny little statements that can really make a person experiencing a disability or an injury feel very uncomfortable. As someone with Parkinson's disease, I've experienced almost all of these as well, where people have said to me things like, oh, lucky you, you get to lie down more when you're fatigued. And they just don't get it. So, Louise, do you have any particular reflections on this?
Yeah, I think that people have great intentions, but they don't often realise that sometimes what they say is not the most appropriate thing to be saying. I've had that, happen to me in my life as well, including from a close friend of mine who was once trying to explain to me when something happened in her life. You don't really understand. It'd be like, suddenly you could hear and then all of a sudden you couldn't hear. And she knew I had a hearing impairment. And for me, that was, I called her out on that. I said, that's the worst thing to say to me. And people just don't, I think about what they're saying.
Yeah, I think all of these answers can be seen to come from a position of genuine interest and concern, but often people jump to the one thing they know about the subject without thinking about how that could be received. We are starting to get some questions in. I'll talk to one of those now. Louise, does having a disability mean other people are more likely to share their experience of disability?
Absolutely not. I have experienced this so much in my own life and my career, and I've had a lot of people with disabilities work in my lab, and when they've come to interview with me, and I interview everyone irrespective of what type of position, I actually declare up front that I have a hearing disability, and none of them except for one person. One person declared their disability and none of the others. And these have included a person who herself had a deafness in one ear, and a person with dyslexia who was an honours student. And these things did come up once there was an issue with communication. And I was just gobsmacked that they were not comfortable in declaring their own disability to me. And I think that's concerning. And it could be that they're just used to it, because we are used to it. We've had to grow up in a world that's made for normal people, and we adjust. Or it could be that they were worried that they would not get a position in my lab because of their own disability. And that's something I find really alarming.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another question, what do you look for in a disability ally?
So an ally needs to listen to us, needs to understand our stories, and needs to understand what is accessible for us and what is not. You know, even my own workplace can sometimes assume, and you know, there's a definition of the word assume. We were talking about this before, because when you assume, you make an us out of you and me. And I think it's really important that everyone remember that. You can't make assumptions about anyone. And this is, you know, everyday life. And being an ally means that really you are supportive, that you are open to adapting, and that you are welcoming as well.
Another question's come through. What are the top 3 things that medical research institutes can do to improve inclusion for people with disability?
Well, the first thing is to start by doing this, and I think doing this really helps to promote awareness. I think it's wonderful. I think it shouldn't wait to be an annual thing. I would love to see you guys doing this at least once a month, and having people internally who are prepared to talk about their disability, or having your reference group include people who don't have a disability, so that they can understand more and advocate for more. You know, they always say that people who are advocating are usually the people who are affected, and having those allies who are not affected is really important as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to make the workplace more accessible. And as Doug said, you know, you can do that. I can give you an example. We get $6,000 a year from Job Access to provide live captioning for seminars at SVR now. So when we have virtual seminars, and I can watch them all virtually anyway, the live captioning is there. And it doesn't just assist me, it assists other people who have hearing impairments, and they do. There are some people who are wearing hearing aids now. And they're actually people who have difficulties with other people's voices or accents, often people who English is their second language, and they also find it beneficial. So just be aware that making things, and don't complain about having subtitles, please. I hate that. My sister-in-law does it as well. And complaining about something that is making things more accessible for another person is just not a good way to be an ally. Please don't do that. We need it. It's there for a reason. So what I would like your input on this though too. I think, you know, I can't answer for everything. And as you know, disabilities is such a broad spectrum. There's so many different types of disabilities, and my experience doesn't just count for everyone else's. So
just briefly, my thoughts are that it is a conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. One doesn't just come out as disabled, because the disability can change, the way that you need to, workplace adjustments can change. So it's really an ongoing conversation, and I just ask people just to be generous and listen.
I think that was a dog interrupting. Was that a dog interrupting question time?
Well, it's always something new here. Jacob Jackson, thank you for that very positive comment. Brilliant presentation, Louise. I'm very proud to know you. Louise, we'll wait till Louise comes back, but please keep your questions coming in. Here she comes.
That's exactly what I was hoping wouldn't happen, but I think it's also important. I couldn't wear this today, but I do want to put it up. Is also
great T-shirt.
Yeah. Thanks, Louise.
Okay.
A question.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. A question from Melanie, or a statement more, sorry. Absolutely inspiring. I will be much more cognizant about disability in the NHMRC scheme going forward, and will endeavour to bring it up a lot to help lobby for change. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
A comment from Megan. Thank you, Louise, for an engaging and inspiring presentation. Feeling warm and fuzzy and hopeful.
Thanks, everyone.
We have another question that's come in. As we learn more about mental health and its unseen impacts on people's lives, are those with bipolar, depression, etc., included as those with a disability?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I have had close encounters with people with bipolar and depression research, and they're wonderful researchers. And they're very much in my mind when I talk about people who have been in my lab with disabilities. I think people need to understand that we just need to support people better and accommodate, and realize that everyone who has an obstacle can still contribute and do amazing things, and they do.
Another question. Great talk, thanks. What was one or two of the most effective things that a leader or a colleague did in the workplace to support you to succeed in your career?
Well, I don't think so much about the workplace, but I think more about people in my research field. And until recently, I didn't have a mentor. I've had many sponsors, and I've had wonderful sponsors who have nominated me for presentations at conferences and that, but I've also made myself noticed by getting up and asking questions at conferences as well. So I think that really is the answer to that one. I can't really say that the workplace, that they're learning now, they're getting better at it, but I've had to be very proactive in making that aware. And I think it's just people assume, like I say, people assume.
A very personal appreciation comment. Thank you for your talk, Louise. I wear hearing aids and understand much of what you say. Sometimes I think I should put up a sign at my desk to make it clear that I might not catch everything people say. Maybe I should get a badge. I've even thought of getting a tattoo near my ear as a visual sign. Even with a brightly coloured hearing aid, not everyone sees hearing aids but behind hair.
And that's exactly it, isn't it? And yeah.
I might add something to that. For me, having Parkinson's, my disability is extremely hidden. And the other day I was getting on a tram, and I kind of don't look like the typical person with Parkinson's. I probably look a bit younger, and I was feeling very fatigued and tired. And I asked someone for a seat, and I said, look, I've got Parkinson's. And the woman looked at me as if to say, I'll give you the seat. I can't be bothered, but yeah, right, as if you have that. So sometimes I wish I had a big T-shirt that said, I have Parkinson's, and here's my letter from my neurologist to prove it. I mean, God, I wish I didn't have this disease, but sometimes it's frustrating when you need some help and people assume that, you know, you look young, and also being a transgender woman, the two can not conflict, but work in different ways together, because people often think, oh, well, you know, we've got to deal with being transgender. Just, you know, how do we also deal with this person being disabled? And you know, there can be some conflicts and tensions there.
Yeah.
But we'll go on to another question. What has been your worst experience related to your disability?
And my worst experience has been that in the instances when I have declared my disability, for example, when I applied for an investigator grant in the first year that they were released, and I haven't since then, I declared my disability to show that I've been doing lots of lots of things in the leadership space. I've been involved in international societies and national societies, but I can't hear on the telephone. And so this in the past has affected my ability to participate in teleconference calls. It's been really hard. I've stayed up at midnight, 1 a.m. to do teleconference calls when I can't even hear on the phone. And so I thought that this would make them understand that, you know, I do a lot of things in the leadership space, but I'm limited by my disability. And unfortunately, that actually gave me a worse score than if I had not declared my disability. And that shows further that bias is a major issue in our peer review system. So.
Thanks, Louise. Another question. You mentioned 1 in 7 people in the community have a hearing disability. How can we make WeHi a more accessible place for people with hearing loss in both our workplace and our wider community? What are considerations for online events?
Live captioning. Live captioning for online events is absolutely a necessity, and also in any media. You know, Carly Finlay is wonderful advocate for people with disabilities on social media and on Twitter, which I joined in 2018, and I wish I'd joined earlier, but I was told it was a way to self-promote yourself, and that's not my type of thing. But it's a great community and great for advocacy and great for learning about different things, including disabilities. And she's always highlighting that if you're putting anything up on any sort of social media platform, it needs to have captions on it for people to understand. And I think also it's really important to remember, if you are trying to recruit people and you don't have captions, and recruitment means in all sorts of different ways, whether or not it's donors for philanthropy or people to come and work at WeHi, students, and you don't provide accessibility for them, they will feel left out, and they will potentially not even get the message, and you will lose people. You will lose great people by not making it accessible for them.
We, the disability group, in setting up this event, learned something on the way, which was that when we set up this as a live Teams event, we forgot to tick the box to have live captions for you, Louise. So, you know, we're still finding out ourselves about how this all works, and we couldn't go back and do it again. It was interesting that we had to find another way to hopefully that you can hear me and understand what what the questions are. So it's definitely something that WeHi still needs a lot of work to do on.
Well, you've been wonderful helping me out with that, Val, because without you, I wouldn't have noticed that Otter have a free app. I'm actually not using it now because it was Bluetoothing to my phone and making it harder for me to understand you. But I think, as I said, if I have issues following any of the questions, I think it's just as important because it highlights that, you know, my disability still does affect me, and cochlear implants are not perfect. They're never going to, I'm never going to have perfect hearing, but it's certainly way better than what it was. I wouldn't have been able to do this with hearing aids.
Thanks, Louise. We've got a couple more minutes, so maybe we'll see if we can squeeze in a couple more questions. Thank you so much for your talk today. You mentioned putting more text on slides and changing colours. How else can we make presenting our research more accessible to all?
Well, I can only talk mainly on my own experience. So for me, text, get your message across. You can do it in small amounts of text, but you need to highlight the key parts so that you can get your message across. Colours, be aware that there are certain colours that people, and colour vision deficiency is also spectrum. So some people see some colours and not others. Some people don't see any colours at all. I know of one person who only sees really greys. And there are websites that help to inform. One of my staff members uses a imaging platform that helps them to choose the colours. That's important. With pictures, alt text is making things more accessible for people who are blind or who have vision deficiency. I actually am very short-sighted. I wear contacts. That gives me perfect enough vision, but obviously it doesn't work for everyone, and alt text is very important. I use alt text on my pictures whenever I post on Twitter. Being aware of that, there's a range of disabilities, and having advice from people affected by those disabilities is really important in helping to improve accessibility for everyone. I can't speak for everyone, as you know.
Thanks, Louise. We'll see if we can squeeze one or two more questions in. How can WeHi foster a sense of community for people with a disability?
Make them feel welcome. Make them feel welcome and appreciated, and realize, and I think the pandemic has made us realize that you can work from home. I know that you guys are already great about flexibility in the workplace, and that's fantastic. Understand what accessibility needs they have to help them work and help them to to continue to contribute, and we have a lot of value to add, and don't look down at us. Don't look as if, don't treat us as though we're lesser human beings. We're not. We are just as important as everyone else.
We've still got quite a lot of questions, but we won't have time. There might be an opportunity for us to take some of these offline and answer them internally. Louise, are there any other comments that you would like to make before we sort of start wrapping up?
I thank you all for doing this. I'm really honoured to be here, and I think it's a wonderful initiative. Val, I want to highlight that I think you're amazing. I hope we know that as well. And having you moderate today was so important to me, so I'm really glad that you've done it. And thank you also for being open about your own disability, because the more that people see other disabled people in the workplace and realise that they're comfortable and they're supported about declaring their disability and about talking about how their disability can be accommodated better, the world will be a much better place. And I think it's really important.
Before I turn to Doug to wrap up, I just want to say once again to Louise, thank you so much for your time and your incredible attention to making this presentation so well-rounded, and both personal and political, but also about your experience, but also giving us a sense of the wider issues that WeHi as well needs to really come up to the plate on. So thank you, Louise, so much, and thank you everyone for attending. Doug, would you like to add a few words?
Just to wrap up, thank you, Belle. Thank you, Louise, for a great seminar, and thank you to the whole team that helped put this together. So big shout out to everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.